Right, good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. We are going to walk on a journey of mining. So I want to talk about the mining sector in South Africa. Why is it important to South Africa? What is our role on a global scale? And how is it also important to our everyday lives as well? And how is it actually going to be very important for the future? So maybe start with the mining sector and its contribution to South Africa. So the mining sector's contribution in South Africa to GDP peaked in the 1980s at about 20% contribution. Currently, at the moment, in 2022, the direct contribution to GDP was about 500 billion. That is about 7.5% of contribution to GDP. Company tax paid was 73 billion. That's 21% of the total company tax paid in South Africa. And in addition, the mining companies also paid about 14 billion of royalties in 2022. Perhaps the question is, what is royalties and why do mining companies pay royalties? Effectively, the state is the custodian of all the land, or the land that mining companies operate on. So when minerals are extracted from the ground, the mining companies will pay a levy or a tax either on your revenue or your earnings line, because what you theoretically, those minerals should be the benefit of all South Africans. In addition, the mining sector is also a large employer. Just under 500,000 jobs is sort of what the mining sector provides. This doesn't include sort of indirect jobs that comes from the mining sector through the supply chains that the mining sector will play a part in, but that direct contribution is about 4.8% of total jobs. If we move on to the JSE, the mining sector is about a third of the stock market. It's a sector that is highly cyclical and highly volatile as well. But when you look at what is on the JSE, at the moment, there are companies on the JSE that no longer have operations in South Africa, but they are still listed. One of the big examples of that is BHP Billiton. If you look at the performance of the mining sector on the JSE, the sector ran up in the 2000s, and that's with the rally in China. It troughed in about 2015 because the market was very concerned about, is there a Chinese slowdown coming? And then from 2015 to about 2020, there was a recovery in the mining sector that was driven by Chinese stimulus and some supply disruptions coming through, specifically in the iron ore markets. Post-COVID, there was a lot of supply disruptions, and that supported the mining sector over the last 3 years. And now we're at a very interesting point in the cycle. There's lots of concerns from a macro perspective. There's lots of questions about China, and there's also a lot of questions of where we see the sector going over the next 20-plus years. So perhaps that leads into what influences global mining and how do we think about it. So I think one of the first parts, and this leverages quite a lot of what David discussed earlier, is global growth expectations is actually a big driver. Where we stand today, there's lots of concerns about a recession, and there's also lots of questions about China. Where is China going, and can they actually move the way they did over the last 20 years? And the question is, why does the mining sector care about global growth expectations? But when you think about GDP, when the countries are having sort of strong economic growth, what do? They spend on infrastructure. What is used significantly in infrastructure is commodities, is mining products. You use steel to build your buildings. Consumers will also have more disposable income, so that means you're able to spend more. When you look at your phone, there's commodities in your phone. The more cash that you have in your pocket, the more that you'll spend. In addition, you'll spend more on home goods as well. If you look at your microwave in your home, the outside of your microwave is made out of chrome. Chrome is a commodity. So commodities are an integral part of your everyday life, and the more money you have, the more you'd spend on it. In addition, your jewelry as well. But it's also an interlinked relationship as well. Because if there is disruptions in the commodity markets, it can actually impact the global markets as well and global growth expectations. And that's a big thing that we saw last year in 2022. When the war in Ukraine played out, there was disruptions in the energy markets, and that and because of the underinvestment in energy, that caused prices to spike up, and that led to inflation, and that also led to the recession concerns that we have now at the moment. And that ties everything that David spoke about, and I'm not going to go back into that. I don't have any mountain climbing pictures in my presentation. So when we talk about commodity markets, we cannot not talk about China. China is one of the integral drivers of commodity markets over the last 20 years. The chart, what we see now on the screen, is steel production. My view is that steel production is effectively a proxy for industrialization and urbanization. It's the starting factor when you think about commodities, because you move up that industrialization curve. From moving from rural to urbanization, once you urbanize, you spend more on consumer type goods. So when we think about it, it's that starting point. You can see how China's steel production has significantly grown over the last 20 years relative to the rest of the world. And China's steel production peaked in about 2020 and 2021. And the outlook for China is that we are past peak steel, but it's still a significant part of the overall global market going forward. And then perhaps looking at China's role in the broader commodity consumption. China is about 70% or consumes about 70% of iron ore. Iron ore is used mainly in steel, and we spoke a lot about steel. And on average, China consumes about 50% of global commodities. If you look at aluminium is in the body of your car. Aluminium is also going to be an integral part of the energy transition. That ties into the discussions that David had with Alex earlier. Copper as well. I think copper is going to be one of the critical metals of the future, used in the energy transition, and is also a critical metal now. It's used in all our electrical wiring. Similarly, nickel. When you think about nickel now, nickel is used in your plating. But nickel is a critical metal because it's going to be used in batteries going forward. Zinc as well. You can't have gates in front of your house without zinc galvanizing them, because then they're going to rust when it rains. David, similar to both David and Rene, David had the opportunity to go to London a few weeks ago, and then what he did was he chatted to Dave Pettit. Dave Pettit is our China expert. He's been looking at the Chinese market for the last 30 years. So David asked him, what is his views on China? What is he seeing now at the moment with China with regard to this stimulus? And what is your expectation for China going forward?
Hi, Dave. So nice to be back in London and to see you again. China, such an important country for us to understand coming from South Africa. 60% of South African goods exports are metals and minerals, and China's the single biggest recipient of those exports. So, whatever's going on in that Chinese macroeconomic story obviously is of interest. We got very excited at the end of last year as China kind of ended its zero COVID policy. It came out. Initially, some of us thought this is really going to be like, when the Western economies came out of their lockdowns, and there's going to be a massive economic boom that's going to flow through for a while. But it already feels we're 6 months in and we're kind of faltering. What's going on in the Chinese kind of macroeconomic story, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the differences between, say, China and the West was that if you think about the COVID policies that they had, while during last year they had some zero COVID policies in place, they're very localized and very targeted. So you had periods of very extreme lockdowns, but it wasn't national. And unlike in the West, they're actually locking sometimes workers in factories so they continue to manufacture. So you didn't have that same load base effect. I think the second piece in terms of a headwind that you might be seeing at the moment, and why it's not bouncing back as fast, is that the housing market is very weak. Okay, and that will continue probably for another 6 to 9 months. I think what's positive is inflation is very low in China. The authorities see these headwinds, and they will continue to ease policy. We've seen interest rates reduced. You'll see measures in the property market ease further. And so already seeing some signs of demand picking up for housing. So I think with a lag, we will see a pickup in activity. In addition to that, in terms of broader manufacturing activity, especially in the renewable sector, we're seeing very strong growth. And so those minerals and metals tied to anything to do with solar or electric vehicles, particularly battery side, to be really strong. So it's a mixed picture. I think you'll see more policy measures to help the economy as we go forward.
I mean, obviously, as well as you've intimated, there are some short-term challenges, but I mean, there are some long-term structural stories at play. I mean, investment's been an incredibly important driver of Chinese growth. It's still got a relatively high investment rate, certainly compared to South Africa. Is the kind of long-term structural story of China being a powerhouse of global growth intact?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's a couple of points I would point to. On the renewable side, I can't stress enough how far ahead the rest of the world China is. Renewable energy, both solar and wind. And when I say ahead of the world, I mean in terms of scale and price competitiveness, and especially on electric vehicles, both the infrastructure they have, but also on the battery side and the manufacturing side. I mean, BYD is almost twice the size of Tesla, and it's growing very, very fast. And so I think in that sense, when you look, apart from certain trade blocks, maybe the US, outside of that, Chinese companies will dominate these huge energy transition industries over the coming years.
So we can see, based on the discussion David had with Dave, that while we do see over the next few months some sort of time or negative headwinds, the outlook for China is still relatively positive. But the question that we always ask ourselves is, what could be the next driver of commodity demand? What could be the next China? What could drive that industrialization? And those are the big topics that we're thinking about. What could be the next driver of the commodity market? And this is one of the things that we are thinking about. The following chart looks at steel per capita and GDP per capita. If you look at the bubbles on the chart, the size of the bubbles is reflective of the population size. So you can see the US is a large size versus you can see Switzerland on the far right being very tiny, but a very high GDP per capita. So one of the big things that we see is as countries move along the industrialization curve, you utilize more steel. But what we see with these countries with a high GDP per capita, your steel intensity hasn't increased significantly. Over the last 20 years, on average, your steel use per capita for these countries has remained relatively in a similar level. And one of the big things about these countries as well is that they're all developed markets as well. I think the one exception is South Korea, who's actually increased their steel use per capita over the last few years. The next is where is China? Where does China sit? So China is about 800 kilograms per person of steel use. So they have a really high steel intensity at the moment. Where have they come from? 20 years ago, in 2000, they utilized 200 kilograms per person. So you can see how significantly Chinese production of steel and Chinese urbanization and China's commodity demand has increased over the last few years. But the question is, where can China go from here? Is there still potential upside from these levels? Potentially, yes. China is targeting an urbanization rate of about 65%, and currently you're sitting at 60%. So there is still a lot potential legs in this story. But the question is, what's next? And that's where we look at emerging markets. And South Africa sits in emerging markets, Namibia, Brazil as well. But we understand what is the headwinds that we're facing in the country. But what these emerging markets don't have is they don't have the population size to actually move along that industrialization curve and pull the commodity markets. But that's where we look at India. India is a rapidly growing country with a large population size and high growth rate. And it has the potential to move up that industrialization curve as well, similar to India. And the Prime Minister of India is also putting infrastructure at the heart of his policies. But where does India differ from China? India doesn't have the same policies and procedures as China, and there's more bureaucracy as well in their system. So there is a higher risk that India doesn't move as fast. And the question is, what is the next big driver? And we've touched on it in a lot of our presentations. And that's the theme of energy transition. And what we also think about is energy security. And I think that's an important concept. Yes, you want to move to a cleaner source of energy over the next few years, but we also need to be conscious on how we move. So if you look at the breakdown of global electricity generation, you can see coal and gas-fired which are fossil fuels, are just over 50% of energy generations, while renewables is about 20-25%. To meet those climate change aspirations that globally we have, you need to increase the renewables part of the scope. And you can see going forward how renewables is actually increasing out to 2030, and it will increase even more out to 2050. But I think what's important from this chart is fossil fuels are still going to be an important part of the overall energy mix. Therefore, you're still going to need investment in fossil fuels, because the important thing is, as we walk on this journey of energy security or energy transition, we need energy security. And we also need to ensure that this transition is going to be affordable, because you still need this transition to be economical for all countries as we walk along this journey. I think this is my favorite chart in my whole presentation because it gives you a lot of information, and it also tells you the story of where we need to go to over the next few years and what's needed in that. So when we think about energy transition, we think about it in 3 pillars. We think about transportation. So it's moving from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. It's investment in renewables. And a lot of the discussions that we always have around energy transition is always renewables, but there's other components within renewables, and it has been touched on in the other presentations. The first one is storage. When you think about your coal-fired power stations, which supplies 85% of our electricity in South Africa, you get base load from that because they are able to run consistently, well, when they are working. But the issue with renewables at the moment is that they run intermittently. Yes, if you structure it properly with both solar and wind, you potentially get smooth electricity, but there is risks that the wind might die down because you're at the hands of sort of like Mother Nature when you're thinking about renewables. So therefore, storage is going to be a critical pillar of energy transition over the next few years. The next component is the grid. And this is something that René touched on in his presentation as well, and it's investment in that grid. Currently, at the moment, how the grid structure has been set up specifically in South Africa, energy will go from your coal-fired power stations to our homes, to manufacturing facilities, to the mines. But it needs to be reworked. And then it needs to shift going from the renewable energy to our homes, to our factories, to our mines. But I think one of the important parts of the evolution of energy transition is what we need to get there. And metals and minerals and the mining sector is going to be critical to get us to that point. But the question is there sufficient metals to get us to that point? So if you look at electric vehicles, there are significant constraints on the group of commodities that you need to actually get us there. You need your copper, your aluminium, your nickel. Similarly for renewables, both in the solar and the wind, there's somewhat constraints in those metal mix. And you can see this trend emerging for both electric vehicles and your renewables. Your copper, your aluminium, those are the top commodities that you're actually going to need. The same story in storage, lots of constraints as well. Similarly, you're seeing your copper, your aluminium. I think from a South African perspective, platinum is also there in that mix. The grid as well, for your transmission and distribution, you need your copper and your aluminium. So what I want to put home to you is that commodities are going to be an integral part of this energy mix, but there are significant constraints because of the underinvestment in supply over the last decade. But we need these commodities for energy transition, but we also need these commodities today for our everyday life. So therefore, energy security is going to be an important part of the transition, because what we don't want is we don't want prices to increase significantly, which will lead to inflation, which would lead to recession as well. The other part that I just want to touch on is, or just anecdotally, what we thought about at the moment with these things is for the metal that you're going to need for copper, we need to mine more copper now that has ever been mined before to actually get the copper needed for the energy transition. And to actually get the sufficient metals that we need in this energy transition, you need to build at least 300 to 400 mines over the next 10 to 15 years. And we're not seeing that level of supply coming through in the mining sector. Therefore, energy security is just as important as energy transition. And as we get to that point, fossil fuels are still going to be an important part of the energy mix. Maybe moving back to South Africa and bringing it back closely to home, but looking at what is our top 4 exports. So we export or globally our supply is 3.7% of iron ore. Coal, we're 7% of global supply. For gold, we're 3% of global supply. But the commodity that's the most interesting is the PGM basket. We're 51% of global supply, but if you look at the components of the PGM basket, we're 71% of platinum and we're 79% of rhodium. And platinum is going to be an important metal that we're actually going to need in energy transition. Included in the PGM basket, there is also going to be copper and nickel as byproducts. And as we saw in the previous chart, copper and nickel is going to be very important commodities that we're going to need in the future. But we can't talk about South Africa without talking about the challenges that we're facing. We spent a lot of time talking about load shedding, but one of the key challenges that we face from an infrastructure perspective is Transnet as well. This rail is very important to the mining sector, but it's also important to our everyday life because we import products into the country like oil and fertilizer that we actually need in our everyday life. The following chart is just a map of Transnet's rail, and there are 2 key ports that's very important to the mining sector. First is Saldanha, where we export iron ore out of, and the next is Richards Bay. One of the key things for infrastructure or the rail is it's needed in the exporting of these bulk commodities. The question is, can't we just truck them out of the country? Number one, it's more expensive. For example, to truck 1 ton of coal, it's $130 per ton, versus if you want to rail coal when the rail's working, it's about $40 per ton. And in addition, it's more environmentally friendly to rail the products, and it's less hard on our roads. I mean, David spoke about the potholes that we're seeing. So what I've done is I've pulled out the coal that has been exported via Transnet over the last few years, effectively looking at the Richards Bay coal line. What we can see over the last few years, how the coal rail line has significantly underperformed. If you take a step back and ask, what is the installed capacity of this rail line? Effectively, we should be railing 75 to 80 million tons per annum. At the moment, or in 2022, we railed just over 50 million tons. That's the worst performance that we've had in 30 years. And the expectation now in 2023 is performance is not going to get much better. But I don't want to just leave you with the negative. I also want to talk about the positive. And there is positive movements coming from the mining sector, where they are engaging with Transnet, where they want to work together to help stabilize Transnet and work and get that efficiencies back online and getting back to installed capacity. And one of the big movements that we've seen over the last few weeks is last week the government announced the new board of Transnet. And one of the chairman of the new board is a former executive of Anglo American. So we can see that public-private participation actually starting to come through. So the mining sector is not just discussing these issues behind closed doors. They're actually stepping forward and engaging with government to bring about this meaningful change that we need. Next, I'm going to touch on load shedding, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail that Rene went in because I think he explained the situation quite well. But what I want to talk about is load curtailment. The mining sector gets load curtailment. What is that? Effectively, the mining sector is told that they need to drop their energy consumption by a certain percentage relative to base load. And this is a structured process similar to how we get load shedding. So if we are on stage 6 load shedding, on average, the mining sector is told to drop the energy consumption by about 20%. On the chart, what you see is the grid consumption of some of the PGM companies. And why did I use the PGM companies? The PGM sector, on average, utilizes about 10 to 15% of Eskom's energy, so it's a good proxy for the mining sector. What we could see from 2018 to 2022 even, is on average grid consumption has been relatively stable and slightly increasing at certain operations. But there is significant downside risk now in 2023. We can see it from the data coming out of the mining companies that production is down year on year. And these concerns as well on safety as well, because it's unsafe to send employees underground to mine if there's concerns about energy availability. But, as I said, bad news, but there's good news always. And René touched on this a bit in his presentation, is what is the mining sector doing and how are they coming to the party and their commitment to bringing on renewable energy. So to date, company announced installed capacity is quite low. It's under 1,000 megawatts. But there are significant plans to bring that up. One of the big headwinds that the sector faced was the licensing requirements, but that was dropped now in December 2022. So we've seen over the last few months company announcements coming through on planned capacity that they want to bring forth over the next few months and years. And this, the mining sector's contribution or planned announcements is about 50% of all planned announcements coming through. So you can see the mining sector is meaningfully stepping up to the plate. On the one hand, this is going to help with our energy transition. It's also going to help with energy security and hopefully with energy costs as well. I suppose pulling everything back, when you think about the resources sector, there's various moving parts. There's the impact of the global markets and global outlook. There's China. We can't control China. But there's also homegrown challenges as well. But there's lots of work being done on addressing those homegrown challenges, but a lot of that work is going to be public-private participation. And that's how we think about the markets as well and how we build up portfolios and think about these stocks. We look at the risks, but we also evaluate the opportunities. And when we look at the mining sector is a significant contributor to GDP. It also has a significant impact on our everyday lives. And it's also going to be very important going forward as we transition. And the mining sector has been a significant contributor to alpha, both on an absolute and a relative basis. And we can see it from our two funds, which we are number 1 and number 3. Thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them. And I'm looking forward to engaging you at the round table.